Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology's book discussion series. Today, we have with us Dr. Jelle P. Wouters, who's a social anthropologist and associate professor at Royal Thimphu College. He studied anthropology in Amsterdam, Oxford, and Shillong, and taught at the universities of Sikkim and Eberhard Karl's University in Germany. Prior to joining Royal Thimphu College in 2015, he's the author of In the Shadows of Naga Insurgency, published in 2018, Nagas as a Society Against Voting and Other Essays, published in 2020. He's the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Highland Asia, the Routledge Companion to Northeast India, and the co-author of Subaltern Studies 2.0, Being Against the Capitalocene, which was published by the Chicago Press in 2022. And very recently, he's also published the Vernacular Politics in Northeast India book, of which he is the editor. And today, I will be talking to him about this new book. So a very warm welcome to you on Doing Sociology. Very happy to have you with us today, Dr. Wouters.
Thank you, Deepali, and thank you to Doing Sociology. I'm very happy and pleased to be with all of you here this evening.
Thank you. To sort of begin our conversation, because this book is about Northeast India, I would request you to talk a little bit about the term Northeast and how the term has been used in social science scholarship.
Yeah. Of course, the designation Northeast India only makes sense after first asking the question, Northeast of what? And the answer obviously here is Delhi and India's so-called quote-unquote mainland. Now, as such, the Northeast is therefore a directional and relational term. It does not exist in its own right, and therefore it has its locus or its identity externally defined. This perhaps explains why many in the region itself do not really identify very strongly with the term Northeast India. This is also the only region in India, in fact, that is formally named after a direction. At the same time, one could argue that besides all of those problems, it's also geographically somewhat problematic. Significant parts of the region are in fact not located northeast of Delhi. The southern tip of Mizoram, for instance, is located at roughly the same longitude as Calcutta, while major northeastern cities such as Guwahati, Imphal, Aizawl, and Shillong are all situated southeast of Delhi. This in a way suggests the imaginateness of the region, I would say.
Right. So the term Northeasterner, does this indicate a locational ambiguity? And can the term be understood in opposition to the term Indian?
I think it cannot be understood in opposition, actually, because it's a relational term. So it acquires its significance only in relation to the Indian mainland. But I think the term, calling a region after a direction, is in a way emblematic of this larger problem, that there is hardly any kind of discourse about the region for itself. So in Indian policy, in Indian political and public discourses, Northeast India is generally kind of presented in the definite and singular, and there is very limited talk about specific states, communities, or localities. There's even less talk about long-standing local attachments, affinities, affiliations, and affects that also extend across the region's borders. Those of you, and I assume all of you who are familiar with Northeast India, it shares borders with China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. But ethnic affiliations, linguistic and cultural and religious affiliations do not really stop short at these boundaries. They readily cut across. So the talk about Northeast India that comes from Delhi, that comes from the mainland, usually kind of proceeds in an anxious and kind of an urgent voice that focuses on the crisis of law and order in Northeast India, or on its insurgencies, its ethnic violence and tribalism, or about internal and international security challenges, failures in governance, the absence of industries, and its general development deficits. So it emphasizes, in a way, the problems and challenges of Northeast India. Now, such discourses are problematic, both because they gloss over vastly different historical and political contexts within the region, and because, and here I come back to the term Northeast India, because they represent the region in terms of what it is not, rather than for what it is, right? So Northeast India is always northeast of somewhere. It is never a region in this sense in its own right. And it is therefore perhaps not very surprising that most people in Northeast India would not feel necessarily feel very strongly to this term. They would rather identify themselves with specific ethnic communities or linguistic affiliations or religious groups rather than with the term Northeast India.
Right. Dr. Wouters, in the introduction to your book, you write that the politics of ethnicity and belonging breed alarming volatility and violence in Northeast India. How does ethnicity define ideas of belongingness in the region?
Yeah. This is a very interesting question because today ethnicity is in a way the key word to understanding politics in the region. But this has not always been the case. If we look at the region traditionally, historically, there was in fact nothing really in the socio-political traditions of most communities that made this kind of current fixation or obsession with ethnicity, with ethnic and tribal identities, right, inevitable. And these ethnic and tribal identities, the way they are understood today, is in terms of a distinct social body that extends over a clearly demarcated territory. Now, in the past, to be sure, people did not have any kind of difficulty in knowing who they were or in articulating relations of sameness and otherness. It's just that they did not do so in terms of a regime of self-reference or, let's say, representation of ethnicity. Instead, they would express sameness and difference in relation to totems, moieties, patries, clans, khels, villages, village clusters, language groups, monastic alliances in certain parts of the region as well, or perhaps as subjects or serfs or followers of certain traditional kings, chiefs, or hetmans. So identity, of course, has always been there, but the ethnicization of identity is probably a fairly kind of recent development. In the past, identities seem to have been much more fluid than they are today. Ethnicity seems to be much more rigid. Now, if we would argue that in the socio-political tradition of the region, ethnicity was not necessarily self-evident, then the question would become, what has changed? What has changed in the past couple of decades that has put ethnicity really on the front stage? I think that a quick but also largely correct answer can be located in the very specific political evolution, institutionalized ethno-governance, and the policies and politics of recognitions by India's what certain scholars in the region call ethnographic state. And here I'm referring to India's distinct, but also quite archaic in a way, criteria of shadow tribe identification, recognition, and classification. And this complemented by a certain kind of politics of political appeasement through what I've been calling in the book ethnic tribal recuperation. And with ethnic tribal recuperation, I would mean the ways through which the Indian state has appropriated what were initially or potentially subversive struggles by channeling them into autonomous arrangements and institutions ultimately tied to Delhi, and which became presided over by a new class of ethnic elites with clear stakes in a pan-Indian disposition. Now, this kind of ST, kind of politics of recognition and ethnic tribal recuperation really became a constitutive force at the heart of the social-political world today. And this itself is generative of new and various ethnogenetic processes, claims, and counterclaims all across Northeast India. Now, when we think about policies of ST recognition, there are many ambiguities and uncertainties. And of course, this is largely also a political process. But what we know is that once recognition is successful, it places a community really at the forefront of affirmative action and rights. However, in actual practice, right, the way the ST recognition unfolds seems to be that they reward evidence of ethnic, tribal, and cultural distinctiveness with state largesse. So I think I would argue that the ethnicization of identities in Northeast India must by and large be understood in relation to the particular trajectory the post-colonial state in this region took on.
Thank you. You've put it so beautifully, just drawing from history as well as the current scenario as to what the politics of ethnicity has been in the region. So moving from there, if you could also talk about ethno-territoriality in the context of Northeast India, and do you think it is connected to the idiom of indigeneity?
Okay. Now, the term ethno-territoriality is not coined by me or any of the contributors to the book. That's really a phrase that was first introduced by the political scientist Sanjeev Barua, and I've been trying to think with this term and expand it further. So ethno-territoriality in the context of Northeast India would refer broadly to place-based rights to a scheduled tribe inside a particular territory with which it is ancestrally identified. So this becomes a territorialized regime of positive discrimination and rights through the sixth schedule, and also through what the historian Willem van Schendel has called the ethnic homeland model in Northeast India. So unlike any other part of India, here we see that certain states have been created on distinctively ethnic lines. We can think about Mizoram, and we can think about Nagaland as certain examples of that. Of course, ethnic and political boundaries do not neatly coincide, but the rationale of the state making or the state formation process was to try and link the two. Now, in all of this, Northeast India is a place of exception. This is because such possibilities and provisions, they depart, and very significantly at that, from the much less elaborate fifth schedule, which exists for quote-unquote mainland tribes, or for that matter from any other forms of India's elaborate affirmative policies, all of which are not territorial in form and character. It is only in Northeast India in which affirmative policy and rights and reservations are linked to specific territories. So here ethnicity and territory become one. And I think this is the kind of the main premise of the notion of ethno-territoriality. Now, this is, I think, an important term because together with recognition as a scheduled tribe, exclusive territorial titles, rights, and political autonomy, in which specific communities can claim these, right, is today actively desired by ethnic tribal communities all across the region. And this has produced a very new kind of ethnic tribal sensibility, perhaps an explicitly new awareness of the political, material, and symbolic assets, right, that successful assertion of ethnic tribal distinctiveness and discreteness could accrue. So here it becomes actually a value to self-express and communicate to others that one is a very distinctive, unique community. Yeah, I think it's largely because of this provision of ethno-territoriality that ethnicity has really come at the forefront, that today we have what we might call the epoch of ethnopolitics, in which everything in the region is humming with ethno-talk, with ethno-consciousness, with ethnopolitics, ethno-performances, and other ethno-practices, right? And in which ethnicity in a way has become the very episteme, if you will, through which most people in the region look at their past, cultivate their self-consciousness, and frame their wider social surroundings, as well as, of course, imagine their political future. Now, the second part of your question, how this relates to indigeneity, I mean, indigeneity is a concept with a particular history. All concepts have a history, obviously. It's not a local concept. It is a concept that was imported or perhaps even imposed on the region. But I think the way it unfolds today is that indigeneity has become an idiom, right, to make ethno-territorial claims. And I think we can put it in a different way. In different parts of the world, indigeneity is used in opposition to the state, right? So one invokes an indigenous identity to express a certain political refusal towards the state. What we see in Northeast India, and of course not exclusively, and there's a lot of variation within the region, is that indigeneity is often invoked in order to make claims on that state. So not to refuse the state, but to create a different state community sociality. I think I'll leave it at that for this question.
Right. No, thank you for that answer. I think now sort of, when we talk about the Northeast in India, there is always this question of resistance and protest which comes along. Whether we're looking at the media or if you're reading any literature, I'm sure a lot of our viewers who work on the Northeast, they will deal with the question of protest and resistance and oppression or subjugation by the state. So my next question is very much related to that. How do the narratives of resistance and protest against the Indian state and oppression and subjugation by the same state play out in the region?
Yeah, that's of course a very large question. And the first thing I should perhaps mention here is that narratives of resistance and protest exist in so many different ways within the region. So it would not be really adequate to talk about a narrative of protest or resistance in the singular. Now, when we look at the years and decades immediately after India's independence, there was a resistance against the democratic system, right? But this was not a resistance, right, against the idea of democracy necessarily, but it was a resistance against what voting would communicate. And voting would communicate an alliance to the Indian constitution, which certain communities were not at that point of time willing to pledge. And the Naga is here the core example. Right? In the 1950s, the Naga, then represented by the Naga National Council, they refused democratic participation. And they did so as part of the struggle for Naga sovereignty. And they boycotted India's first two general elections in 52 and 57. Now, over the years after that, other underground and revolutionary groups in the region, particularly in Manipur, but also in Assam and Meghalaya, have also called election boycotts at different times and with varying levels of success. Right? Some failed, some were fairly successful. But the main message there was a rationale of political refusal. Now, today, I think the logic is a little different. There are still many election boycott calls in the region. However, these are no longer, in most cases, acts of outright rebellion that communicate a refusal of the Indian state. I think today, and I think the book also gives a number of examples on that, they are best kind of interpreted as the staging of protest or as acts of negotiation in relation to particular state policies or in protest of miscarriages of justice or to draw attention to specific political grievances and claims. Right? So they are not against the state, but they are rather a protest against specific aspects of state policy. Now, these obviously are protests with very high stakes, as they step at the very heart of the state's legitimacy, which is the democratic process. Perhaps I should give a small example of what I'm trying to express here. In Assam, between 79 and 83, for instance, several seats to the Indian parliament were left vacant to protest the alleged the government policy of admitting and enfranchising illegal immigrants. And in Manipur, the Maira Pabi, which is the Meitei women organization, have called for election boycotts to protest sustained human rights abuses in the state. And in Naga areas, there have been boycott calls arguing that what Nagas need are not elections, but a solution to the very protracted Indo-Naga conflict. So what we see here is that protest is no longer an act necessarily of political refusal, but is increasingly a way of staking claims on the state, of making the state act in a different way. And this goes all the way down to local levels. In recent years, there were villages in Assam and Arunachal that collectively refused to vote. And the reason why they refused to vote is because their politicians had not really kept their promises. For instance, mostly in terms of development. So perhaps here we see that boycotting elections has become a way through which local communities who otherwise may not have much tools or strategies to make themselves heard are able to voice their demands and their grievances in relation to the state. I think my main argument here would be, right, that the narrative of protest was, in certain parts of the region, initially an act of political refusal, but today, increasingly so, it is an act of staking claims on the state. I think the logic has changed.
Right. Dr. Wouters, final question, my final question for today's discussion is, if you could maybe talk a little bit about how the process of decolonization is taking place in the Northeast.
Okay, that's another very big question. I mean, complete decolonization, first of all, does not really seem to be a possibility, at least not in the present kind of institutional framework, because the entire state framework is modeled along colonial and Euro-American lines. So decolonization was only ever half done. But even if you want to do it halfway kind of decolonizing, there are again a large number of ways in doing so. So let me perhaps specify how we have tried to do so in the book. And we have tried to do so in relation to the term vernacular. So the book is not about politics in Northeast India, but it's about vernacular politics in Northeast India. Now, vernacular we see in some way as in a certain kind of dialectical tension with the idea of normative democracy. Now, normative democracy is really the domain of political philosophy and certain corridors of political theory, in which the question is really, what should democracy look like? How should elections be conducted? And if actual practices are not following up on that, people start speaking of a democratic deficit, right? Now, vernacular politics takes a different kind of starting premise. It does not look at how democracy should be, but about how democracy actually functions, right? So the idea of vernacular would mean, from this angle, that we look at politics not through let's say, a top-down kind of a perspective, but we look at what politics means through local categories, through local values, through local experiences, and through local perceptions. And what we see in this process is that everywhere formal democratic institutions become mixed and mingled, or we can say socially enmeshed, with historical particular traditions, with certain pre-existing value systems, with certain hierarchies of gender and generation perhaps, that may predate the arrival of democracy. So it's very much along the lines, if you mix two colors, a third color comes out. Here, what we see, if you mix democratic institutions with cultural specifics, a new kind of blend comes out, right? So this is vernacular in one sense. In another sense, vernacular also would mean that we approach politics not through outside concepts, but through local vernacular languages, right? So how do people actually speak about politics? What makes a politician good or bad, right, in the eyes of the voters, which may be very different from what a political theory textbook on democracy might tell you. So I think here the notion of vernacular comes in two ways. One way would be to privilege the local, right, over the normative. And second way would be more in terms of methodology, to actually look at politics through vernacular local languages. And this allows for kind of a grounded theory that comes from within the region itself. So what the authors, the contributors have tried to do is not to take a theory from elsewhere and evaluate its relevance in the context of Northeast India, but to really try to theorize bottom-up through the eyes of their ethnographic kind of friends and interlocutors they have worked with.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Wouters, for discussing your new book, today with us. It has been absolutely incredible listening to you. I'm sure our viewers, a lot of them are young researchers. For those who are working on the Northeast, especially on politics and on the vernacular in Northeast, I think they will have a lot of take from this discussion. And even those who are not researching on the area but want to know about it, I think this is a fantastic copy to grab and read to learn about the area. So thank you so much for talking to us today. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.